As well, there is the border agency, which practically, of course, carries out border duties on the border. Is that within the political control of the Home Office, or is that an entirely independent agency?
So Border Force, and clearly the head of Border Force at the time was Paul Lincoln, would absolutely be part of the Home Office and responsible, accountable, working with myself and our ministers and our BICS team and Border Force team within the Home Office.
In terms of the overarching requirement to draw up and draft regulations, in terms of the operationalisation of those regulations and in terms of the enforcement of regulations, you must have reflected that this was a particularly complicated framework.
So, very candidly, I mean, I do recall some of those discussions, and I do also recall what a fraught period that was within government at that time. We're speaking now very much about the first quarter, in fact, the first month of the pandemic, effectively, January 2020. And of course, with all of that, there were a range of border measures that were discussed. I'm sure you've touched on them already within this inquiry. But we had a clear role, effectively, of helping and supporting the repatriation of UK citizens from abroad during the month of January 2020. That was clearly a key thing.
I'm going to come to some of the specific measures in a moment, Dame Priti, if I may. Can I ask you, before we look at those, though, about the overarching approach to borders? Border control is undoubtedly a divisive issue. It's politically quite a sensitive issue. In the framework of the coronavirus crisis, it was not just a political issue, but very much a public health matter as well. We're going to see in a moment how the Home Office receive advice from NERVTAG and SAGE and from your own Chief Scientific Advisor within the Home Office as to what could be done about borders. So I want to ask you, to what extent were decisions concerning borders and restrictions and closures, or whatever they may be, driven by political considerations as opposed to pure public health matters?
So I don't think there's a straightforward answer to that at all, because there are live discussions across government during that period. As I've just mentioned, it was a fraught time. The world was changing quite rapidly. We could see some countries doing different things, while at the same time we all witnessed very terrible scenes on our TVs, you know, of the impact of coronavirus around the world in certain countries. Our hands, I think, were effectively forced, really, because of Wuhan, what was happening in China. And that led to a series of measures that are documented in some of the evidence statements that have been provided around borders, visas, etc. So there were a range of discussions, and I can absolutely categorically state at an official level across governments in particular. So I had one official, Paul Lincoln, the permanent secretary at the time. Others were in active discussions around what this meant in terms of public health. What it meant in terms of our day-to-day operations within government, for example. I mean, I went on, and I think it may be touched on in one of the witness statements, to look at our resilience plans, for example. What would be business as usual for our department? Bear in mind the political context of the time, January 2020, we'd just had an election in 2019. I was due to actually implement legislation around immigration. So ending free movement, the immigration bill we were working on through that period. So, you know, there were live discussions. You could argue in some quarters they were political. Absolutely, they were political for obvious reasons, while at the same time we were having practical discussions every single day with officials and ministers. Certainly within my department, and officials were having cross-government discussions around some of the implications, the health situations we're seeing, and where this could eventually go.
May I just pause you there? In light of what was obviously a very complex scenario with competing considerations, some public health, some political, some immigration, obviously the critical issue of applying public health restrictions whilst maintaining a critical flow of supplies and trade and food and medicines and critical goods, Was it the case that in the Home Office, as with other government departments, you had to start your assessment of how all these competing considerations could be brought together and resolved from scratch? There was no guide or, to use a inappropriate expression, a playbook for how, in the face of a oncoming viral pandemic, decisions could or should be taken about what to do about borders. You had to really start from the beginning and see where you went.
I can understand why externally that may be the view and the perception, but there had been work that was undertaken by previous governments, and I'd not been in those discussions, around what to do if there was an influenza pandemic, for example. I think Ebola has been touched on as another example. And there had been, and I am aware of this because I was involved in a conversation in January involving one of my officials at the time, work had been undertaken in the past. So we can't just say that, fast forward to the pandemic, it was just a blank sheet of paper. There were processes in terms of understanding what could and couldn't be done. I think within the context of the coronavirus pandemic, which was different for lots of reasons that you are discussing in this inquiry, there were measures that were simply not available to us in terms of health measures, identification of coronavirus at the border, for example. I remember having one of those discussions with Professor John Aston at the time in the Home Office.
Just pause there. Was he the Home Office Chief Scientific Advisor?
That's correct, yes.
Nevertheless, Dame Priti, although there may have been processes in place, and plainly it would be absurd to imagine that there were no processes at all in place for determining how to deal with borders, at least within the Home Office, in the face of any sort of crisis. There were no sophisticated or developed plans setting out, perhaps by way of a step-by-step process, this is what you do to borders in terms of screening or restrictions or quarantine or closure in the event that there is a viral pandemic or epidemic identified offshore in Europe or the rest of the world, and a clear indication that it's coming. You had to effectively sit down and work out step by step what you should do.
I think that's fair. I do think that's fair, and that's a process of iteration where we're constantly asking questions. As I said, we're a practical department, so on that basis, constantly asking challenging questions. A lot of it around technical capability, as well as the powers that we may have within the immigration sphere and the border sphere, and powers that we may not have.
Indeed. Your witness statement at paragraph 28 makes plain that on the 10th of January, the Home Office provided route-specific passenger data to Public Health England, and on the 3rd of February, you paused the processing of visa applications from any individual who travelled through or been resident in Wuhan or the Hubei province. And that hold on processing was extended to another country. And then, of course, everything was swept away by the impact of the lockdown. Could you just make plain, though, that the efficacy of that second measure, the pausing of the processing of visa applications, had a direct impact on the number of persons who could then enter the United Kingdom from that region? You don't need to stop people at the border to stop them coming to the United Kingdom. You can pause the processing of visa applications, and that has a significant practical impact.
That is correct.
All right. At paragraph 33, you make plain that following the World Health Organization's announcement of a novel coronavirus on the 9th of January, as you've mentioned, Border Force officials began providing passenger data for routes specified. What was the purpose of that? How did that help in the defence of the realm in relation to the oncoming virus?
So it was self-evident at this stage, increasingly, that there were hotspots, known hotspots, particular countries, around the world where coronavirus was clearly a major problem. And of course, that information was really pivotal to the Department of Health, Public Health England in particular, in anticipation of potential other measures, but also people travelling back to the United Kingdom in terms of community transmission, for example. And that became quite a topic of conversation, certainly throughout January, but in February and in March. Clearly, from a scientific perspective, with regards to that reproduction value, the R value, and also what that would mean in terms of public health measures domestically. And then, of course, the whole challenge that the Department of Health had, which is managing the capacity within the NHS.
Was it the position, Dame Priti, that throughout the crisis, the Home Office was guided in relation to decisions in relation to the United Kingdom border by advice from NERVTAG, then SAGE, and of course your own departmental officials, in particular the Chief Scientific Advisor, Professor Ashton, whom you've mentioned?
That's absolutely correct.
And in paragraph 34 and in particular 35, do you therefore make plain that decisions as to whether or not screening measures could be put in place, for example, temperature checks, decisions as to whether or not there could be any sort of proportionate or percentage reduction in the number of passengers through the borders, travellers through the borders, and ultimately questions about closure or quarantine, were all significantly guided by the scientific advice. Would it work?
That's correct.
And were you placed in the position, in effect, of being informed that screening, temperature checks, seeing whether people were displaying symptoms was practically ineffective because symptoms can be suppressed and screens aren't effective? A significant closure of the border would be unlikely to delay the onset of the virus significantly and would be extremely difficult and would have terrible ramifications in terms of the passage of people and trade. And there was no real question ever of being able to shut the borders completely and have in place a quarantine system because the practicalities of that had never been worked out.
So that's absolutely correct. And all the evidence and the documents that have been supplied to the inquiry show that very clearly. And the advice that I received, and I think was shared widely across government at the time, showed that it would have a minimum impact in terms of preventing the spread of the virus, in terms of community transmission. And importantly, I also recall receiving in advice to me that it would not actually even assist the NHS in terms of preparations, the time that they would need in terms of coping around the number of people that were coming into the NHS. And I think there are a couple of other important points to make around the documentation and the evidence and the advice that's being provided. The advice is one aspect of this, but actually coming back to the practicalities of trying to put in technical measures to, I think the term was used, heat test people that were coming through the border. The government did not have that capability, and that became self-evident very early on. I was picking up conversations and information from particularly Cabinet Office through some of the meetings that we were involved in then, that they did not have the technical capability. Then, of course, there'd be this murky area about, well, who would have responsibility for what? Would you then bring in public health officials? Is it going to work? How much information can you actually operationalise at the border, and would that be practical? And then, of course, I was heavily involved in, and this wouldn't be of no great surprise, I was heavily involved in the discussions around critical supplies. So even speaking to counterparts in Europe, for example, our French colleagues, and my colleagues within Border Force, so that would have been Paul Lincoln's team in particular, they'd be speaking to their opposite numbers in France, primarily because we could see pressures in France at their border and all sorts of restrictions that they were encountering that could actually have a pretty devastating impact upon critical goods and supplies coming into the United Kingdom. And of course, that would have ramifications, whether it's in the NHS, food supplies, all sorts of things. So we had a lot of intensive work across government taking place, very specifically in that area.
And just before the break, just drawing the threads of the advice that the Home Office received together, your statement makes plain that at a relatively early stage, in fact on the 3rd of February, the Home Office received advice, I think ultimately from Spy MO, to the effect that there may, and I emphasise may, because it wasn't in fact until later in February that this was confirmed, but that there may already be sustained community transmission in the United Kingdom. So obviously that had a direct impact on the sense or efficacy of putting into place border arrangements.
And that really summed up the situation, and the evidence was there. And I think even in terms of community transmission, but the number of people that were clearly falling ill was demonstrating that impact within the NHS. And even, well, I know we'll come on to
that I think, if I may interrupt, was at a later stage, that there wasn't really an impact in the NHS at that stage.
Not at that stage, but that's effectively what the information was alluding to, that clearly community transmission was starting to pick up, and therefore all the subsequent, any measures at the border would simply not have made a difference at that stage.
And then moving forward to the time of the lockdown, the 23rd of March, did the Home Office receive from SAGE advice that by that stage, closing the borders completely, or perhaps with a quarantine system to back it up, would have a negligible impact on the spread of the virus, because the number of people coming in through an open border at the end of March would only comprise a tiny proportion of the overall number of people in the United Kingdom who were already infected.
And yes, and on that basis as well, people have started to reduce their travel. So we saw internationally other countries are bringing in their own travel restrictions. So that in its own right was working through the system at that particular time.
And so finally on this topic of borders, the position that the Home Office and the government confronted or had to face in February, March 2020 was that there was a distinct absence of practical capability to be able to restrict the infection through the border. And secondly, there was no sophisticated or effective system already thought about, drawn up, and ready to be put into place when the virus emerged.
I think that's absolutely correct. And with that, no technical capability. I think the capability, technical skills, there are things that we'll come on to later. Passenger locator form was one example of that. But at that stage, that the skills and capability simply weren't there.
My lady, is that convenient?
Certainly it is. Sorry, I think you were warned that you may have to go. I'm so sorry about it. I shall return, because we have been overrunning. Another apology, slightly shorter lunch, at 10 to 2.
Thank you.
All right.